From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. After years of build-up and nervous expectation, the US presidential election is mere days away. Millions will be exercising their franchise, but with American democracy somewhat trampled out in the last 4 years, and some polling and tabulation centres now bracing for swift upset, is the battle for the Republic just getting started?
There's one particular tabulation centre in Maricopa County in Arizona where there's been quite a bit of trouble in the lead up to the vote, where snipers are going to be deployed on the roof and drones operated by the police flying overhead.
I mean, that is incredible, isn't it? Snipers on the roofs. Why on earth is that felt like it's needed?
Yeah, this is unprecedented. This is sort of scenes we have never seen before. And the reason simply is because of the level of threat perceived. People are really worried. Local officials are really worried. They've been threatened. They've seen these drive-by shooting, bullet holes in their windows. Mail election workers have also had active shooter training. So what happens if there's a gun attack when they're in the middle of polling day? They know what to do, where to hide, that sort of thing. Panic buttons have been installed. There was another story this morning of a US congressman asking for state troopers to come and guard his election party night because he's so worried that it might get attacked. This is not real. This is not normal. And that's precisely why people are reacting. You might think overreacting, but they would say, listen, the threat is absolutely live and there.
The story today: how violent could the US election become? Tom, can you introduce yourself, who you are and where you are?
Tom Newton Dunn, and I'm covering the US election for The Times.
It seems quite hyperbolic to be discussing the possibility of some kind of civil war post-election, however we might understand that. And yet, in the aftermath of 2020, maybe it's worth just reflecting on that for a moment, we did see quite incredible, shocking, divisive scenes.
Yeah, we did. Those images of January the 6th, in fact, Kamala Harris has been incredibly keen over the last week and will continue to in the run-up to Tuesday. He's been very keen to point those out again. That was effectively a democratic insurrection. Congress was ransacked, protesters broke in, people died, and you had protesters on the floor of the US Senate stopping a very important part of the US election from taking place, which was the certification of the vote that obviously gave the presidency to Joe Biden. Eventually, protesters were cleared out and the vote was certified and he became president. But it was incredibly ugly and really haven't seen anything like that in America or quite frankly anywhere else in the democratic Western world for many decades.
Rioters rampaging, waving for the first time inside this Capitol. Confederate flag that symbolized the cause to destroy America.
And now the clock is ticking down to actual voting day for Americans in this latest presidential election. Why so close to the election was this question something that you wanted particularly to look at?
Well, we've seen a bit of violence on American streets associated with elections since 2020. I covered the 2020 election. I witnessed quite a bit of that. But I was struck coming back here just how more divided people are, if that's even conceivably possible. There were big divisions in 2020, big divisions in 2016 when Trump stood against Hillary Clinton for the first time. But now it felt like people were even more polarized, even more dug in, and even angrier. It really felt like an unstoppable force hitting an immovable object. Only one side can win. And it's been really perplexing me since I arrived over the summer to work out what then happens to the other side. How did the other side take it? And really, where does America move forward as one country? because it's absolutely two countries split down the middle. And some 27% of all Americans now fear the eruption of serious violence after the election and the aftermath. That's a quarter of the entire country who are now incredibly worried about what comes next.
And of course, we hope it goes smoothly, but what are some of the scenarios that could most likely seed that violence?
Well, I've been talking to someone called Mike Rogers, who's the chief security analyst for International SOS, who are one of the biggest risk management companies in the world. They've got 90 offices all over the place, and they do briefings for their clients about what to expect and what could happen in worsening security situations. They've done one on the American election. And Mike has come up with 4 potential triggers that could turn a tense and difficult situation into quite a serious one and potentially tip us into sustained period of violence. One is a very thin margin of victory for the winning candidate. So the result turns out to be very, very close. And we know this race is absolutely on the knife edge. There's nothing between the two candidates. The second one is a period of uncertainty before the result is known of 48 hours or more. So there's a wait, there's a delay, there'll be recounts, there'll be legal challenges. The third is inflammatory comments by senior political leaders, especially ones who don't accept defeat or potentially claim victory early. And a lot of people are expecting Donald Trump to do that within hours of the polling places closing on Tuesday night. That sets off an unhelpful narrative. And the fourth is a very unhealthy information environment, as Donald Trump likes to call it, fake news. So false claims, disinformation, and of course there's the role of foreign state actors in all of this. So the Iranians, the Russians, we know are going to do their level best to try and spread that disinformation. And the most critical period will be that immediate aftermath of the election, potentially before the winner is known. And if there's a dispute over precisely who's won. And it just needs a spark, a powerful spark to set it alight. And one way of that happening is a lone actor carrying out either a terrorist attack or an assassination on a high-profile figure, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, or someone significant. And that is the sort of thing that is incredibly hard for the security services to spot. They're on top of some of the more organized plots, but that lone actor who leaves no digital footprint and no clue of what he's about to do, and suddenly all that tinder that was sitting there dry is alight.
How much does all of this cut both ways? Of course, there's only one candidate in this election who has inspired an insurrection on the Capitol in the past. I mean, is there a world in which there's a narrow Trump victory and some far left activists take to the street and do something awful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the experts we've been speaking to say that there is the risk and serious risk of violence, whoever wins. So this is such a disputed election. This is so close. Both different camps are so polarized. All their supporters feel so passionately about this that absolutely there's a risk. The ideal situation is one or other wins by a landslide. Suddenly all those 7 swing states just fall into one or other's columns. And it's possible. And then there's, I suppose, little left to argue about. But I think the threat is considered to be larger if Donald Trump loses, simply because he has done quite a significant job in the run-up to this election, as has his supporters, to suggest the only way he could lose is by theft.
And our primary focus is not to get out the vote. It's to make sure they don't cheat. Because we have all the votes you need. You can see it. Every house along the way has signs, Trump, 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 Trump fans, Trump fans.
And I think that's very much seen as trying to lay the narrative of a stolen election should he potentially lose. There are legal suits launched by the Republican Party underway in quite a few different places.
And explain some of the legal suits that you mentioned there, because that's interesting that this is happening even before most of the votes have been cast. What are they trying on that front?
Pretty much everything. The answer to that is quite extraordinary, just what's going on. The lawfare, which is a completely different element to how this election is being fought. The GOP, the Republican Party, have launched something in the region of 130 different legal suits already across the different states and all the different sort of counties of different states on pretty much everything from challenging the right of people have to vote, whether they're newly arrived into the country, whether they've been living overseas for too long.
Tell us about one of these places in particular where this is raging. In Georgia, there's been a particularly sort of juicy legal fight.
Yeah, Georgia is one of the key 7 swing states, a hugely contested state. We don't know who's going to win that one. And remember in 2020, it was possibly the most contested state after the election. A huge fight then developed. Joe Biden ended up winning Georgia by 10,000 votes. And you remember Donald Trump rang to say, I just need you to find me 10 more thousand votes and I can win this thing.
We're going to begin with this, a stunning phone call where President Trump is heard pressuring officials to overturn the election that he lost. CBS News has obtained audio of the president asking Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger, to, quote, find thousands of votes that he would need to win.
In fact, there's a prosecution underway still for Donald Trump on precisely that, on racketeering and election interference. So it's a real hotbed. It's a Republican-controlled state, Republican governor, and some Trump supporters have now gained control of the election board. They've tried to change the rules. They say to make the election fairer. But one of the things they've done is to give local county election workers the right to refuse to certify the results in their areas if they believe there's been foul practice. This went to court. The Democrats sued, and the judges said, no, you can't do that. Votes are votes, and you're going to certify it no matter what. And the row goes on and on and on. But just the numbers here are quite staggering. So the Democrats have already on their side got 400 permanent lawyers working in the Harris campaign, 400 different lawyers to prepare arguments and counter-arguments of challenges that might be coming in. And they've got 10,000 further lawyers on standby, retained all across these states to go into battle for them in the courtrooms. Absolutely, this is going to be, and already is, a front in part of the election campaign war.
A front which will be fought, of course, mainly after the election. But I wonder right now, does that already feed back into the narrative of you can't trust these elections, you can't trust the way your vote is counted?
That's absolutely the case. There was an extraordinary poll finding the other day that showed only 28% of Republican voters actually have confidence in the accuracy of the presidential election result. That means the vast majority of them don't. The number is a lot higher for Democrats, but remember, a lot of Republicans, in fact, the majority, still believe that Donald Trump should have won in 2020 and that election was stolen for him. And they've been told for the last 4 years, still today, Donald Trump says, I should have won in 2020, that the result wasn't fair. So if you're told that over a concerted period of time, and that's your political leader, and that's the guy you want in the White House, sooner or later you end up believing it.
And all of those arguments, as and when they do happen after Election Day, will take time, won't they? And that's a worry.
They will take time, and not just hours or days, potentially weeks and possibly even months. If you remember back to what happened in Florida in 2000 with the hanging chads and all that, that took 6 weeks to resolve. And I think the real worry with that, as we talked about a bit earlier, is in a deeply contested result, if there is a delay, that delay creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is too easily filled. We've seen everywhere these days with disinformation, false narratives, and before you know it, a narrative could be up and running with one campaign or the other, which then gets America into quite a dark place, and it's extremely hard then to reverse out of that.
Tom, we've been discussing what has been happening, well, in the build-up to voting day in the US, as everyone expects some kind of argument, at least once the results are handed down. One thing that we saw last time during those Capitol riots on January the 6th was not just individuals who were furious, but there was quite a bit of organisation. We had that far-right militant group, the Proud Boys, who played a big role. You've been canvassing opinion from people who study these kind of groups and people. I mean, how have they evolved in 4 years? I mean, what kind of a threat might they be this time around, groups like that?
We had a very long conversation with Dr. Amy Cooter, who is probably the US expert on militias. She spends her whole life studying them, what's happening to them. And she was fascinating, actually. Militias played a huge part in 2020. They were very visible, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. And you could see them when we were here in 2020. They'd be out in the streets, often carrying their automatic weapons in open carry states and looking pretty threatening. And of course, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were the two great mobilizing factors in the January 6th attack on Congress. Since then, some of these militias, the far-right militias, have now really become defunct. The Oath Keepers is not really a force anymore at all. A lot of their members went to prison, some of them for the January 6th attack. The Proud Boys are still up and running, but they're far less visible. And it's actually quite hard for the likes of Amy Cooter to really keep tabs on them because they've made themselves less visible because they know the authorities are all over them like a cheap suit. her feeling is that the threat is less on them. They're less organized. Certainly that sort of national level of organization doesn't really exist anymore. But that doesn't mean to say they don't exist. They are still there, especially on a county level. Local militias who still have strong feelings, still have some pretty right-wing views, and still, by and large, extremely supportive of Donald Trump. And they're to be potentially mobilized if, for example, there is a catastrophic event that really, really does upset them, such as that lone actor carrying out an assassination.
And also, not necessarily to make this so doomy and gloomy, but there's an element as well of these people knowing what is possible, isn't there? We've already seen someone take a shot and hit a presidential candidate, a former president, Donald Trump. They've already seen maybe people like them or even themselves storm the Capitol and get into the Senate chamber. They know what is possible, and that must affect the dynamic this time around.
Totally, and I think on both sides. So this is very much round 2 or round 3, if you like, but certainly round 2 after the pretty awful things that happened in 2020, and both sides are prepared. So on the government side, huge efforts have been gone into for the security services, the US military, the National Guard are on standby for January 6th to police Washington, D.C. itself. And Washington, D.C. is not expected to be that flashpoint again on January the 6th. The same date, by the way, where Congress has to meet to certify the final Electoral College result, because really it's going to be a ring of steel. But I think the worry is more in state capitals. Another big date coming up is December the 17th, where the states themselves have to certify their electoral college vote before they then dispatch it to Washington. It's the sort of state capitals, state election offices that could come under some sort of attack in a purposeful attempt to lobby and persuade and threaten those state representatives, those local state politicians, not to certify that result if the people protesting don't want it to happen and their candidate has lost. So that is potentially where we could see the militias, if they are mobilized and they are wanting to. And no one does want this at the moment. There is not an appetite for a physical fight, a civil war. But you can certainly see those foundations now, and you can see how those buttons could be pressed that then trigger a more worrying security environment.
And not just militias. If there's one thing we know about ordinary Americans, they are armed. And in the build-up to this election, just like the last one, more so.
Yeah, very much so. America is already a country awash with guns. Some 400 million guns exist in America, which is some 70 million more than our actual people, which is quite an extraordinary statistic. But we went to a gun shop in a place called Forest Park, which is a quite blue-collar, working-class neighborhood of Atlanta, southern Atlanta.
Yes, so this is AK-47. Has a drum on it. It is military style, large capacity. You can put a lot of ammunition in it.
Yeah. And we discovered that gun sales, and especially ammunition sales, have seen quite a significant uptick over the last 3 months. Ammunition is up by about a half, and they're now selling something like 100 rounds an hour in his shop.
We sell ammunition every day, nonstop, all day, every day. We sell probably, 50 to 100 cases of ammunition every day, and that's on the low end.
That's someone in the firing range now?
Yes, they are, yes.
They're now selling 15, 20 guns a day. That's up by about a third. But firing ranges, there's a firing range attached to the gun store. That now sees 300 people a day coming through it at the weekends, which is up 100% in the last few months. And as explained to us by Chad, the guy who runs the shop, that's precisely because people are now getting a little bit worried.
Now that we're getting close to election time, people just want to come in and practice. So we also do instructions here, or they'll buy a firearm and then use that firearm to train as much as possible.
They don't want to fight either, but they just do want that extra ability to protect themselves if things do start to turn nasty.
You know, they don't want to be in a position where they have to defend themselves, and the laws are now on their side. So they're asking us about different various laws. They're asking us about for training, and they just want to be prepared. You know, I think every American, we have the right to carry, so why not prepare yourself?
And you met some of these people at Trump rallies and things who were saying that they actually would be willing to fight if it came to it.
Yeah, it's not a particularly common view, but again, no one wants this fight. But the views are so deeply held now, the sentiment is so strong, and the belief in each side, the Trump side, as much as the Harris side, that their candidate should be the rightful moral victor, that they say, if that is threatened, then they're prepared to take up arms over it. I spoke to a house painter, and he painted Trump on his face in household paint, which he said he didn't quite know how he was going to get off at the end of the day. But he had incredibly strong feelings and made it very clear what he was prepared to do.
We'll see a war. I think we will. But I'm prepared to fight.
With a gun?
Especially. I'm protecting my family. I'll die for mine.
But what about Trump? Would you fight for him?
Absolutely. He's family.
He's family.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
He's just a politician.
No, he's not. He's a businessman.
And in terms of how all of this might play out, Tom, when we say civil war, I mean, that's quite a provocative thing to suggest, isn't it? We're not talking about, another Battle of Gettysburg. It's something that might be a bit more, well, you've been speaking to somebody who said it might be a bit more akin to what we saw perhaps in Northern Ireland, just sort of general, terrifying, near constant unrest. Yeah,
I think the days of pitched battles where two armies agree to meet on a green field like the Battle of Gettysburg are very much long gone, and modern day civil wars look far more like counterinsurgencies. The sort of thing that we saw in Northern Ireland for 30 years, the Troubles, violence, quite ugly violence, assassinations, sectarian attacks. It is that kind of environment that I think we'll be looking towards. And Barbara Walter, who I spoke to, probably the world's expert on civil wars, she's literally wrote the book about it in 2022 and has spent quite some time advising the CIA as well as being a very prominent academic. She says that the US is now really ticking all the boxes for exactly the sort of democracies she studied across the world that have ended up falling into civil wars.
The countries that experience that are overwhelmingly presidential systems based on majority rule. So they have winner-take-all elections. They have deeply divided political parties that distrust each other. So it's not just that there's polarization, but the parties actually don't trust that the other side will do what's right and good.
One side thinking the election was stolen, and particularly one side having lost an election twice in a row, and therefore feeling that they have no recourse via the ballot box to get what they want. They think they've been robbed, and therefore they look for other ways, which is turning to violence.
So it feels very tense. It feels like it's an all hands on deck moment. And I think we're going to look back on these few months and weeks and think, oh my God, that was the calm before the storm. And we had no idea, or we didn't appreciate it.
And because of the example again of 2020, and because this is arguably a closer election, it's definitely been a messier, a nastier election. I don't know if you'd agree with that point. The thing that jumps out of me from talking to you, Tom, about all of this is it sounds like January the 6th wouldn't be the flashpoint that I'd be worried about now. It would be the day after the election.
I think it could be anything. I think it could be anything from the day of the election itself, from the morning we all wake up on November the 5th, where tensions are particularly heightened. Everyone's feeling very, very emotional. It is the big run-up. And remember, US elections last a year at least. So everyone has had a lot of this for a very, very long time. Any incident that is catastrophic, that is ugly, could then trigger another one. And this is a country where political violence really has become normalized. Those two different assassination attempts, polling stations attacked, ballot boxes blown up. These sort of things don't lead the news anymore. They're sort of fourth-fifth down the item on the running order. And that normalization of political violence is going to have consequences sooner or later, and especially if someone does put that match to that pile of dry tinder. And I don't think anyone's saying, I don't think, and even Barbara Walters doesn't think that a civil war is either imminent or guaranteed. It's just that the building blocks are there now. All the constituent parts now are potentially in place for a really horrible situation, a potential civil war. And you can now see how those elements could join up together. It's still more unlikely than likely, but it's certainly now visible.
And even if none of those worst case scenarios happen, Tom, I guess the damage has already been done on the impact of democracy, hasn't it? I've been keeping a list as we've been talking of all the terrifying things. You've discussed political violence being normalised, snipers on polling place roofs, more guns than people, lawfare being prepared, if not already underway, militias who have experience of storming the Capitol possibly want to do something similar again. This isn't a functioning democracy, aside from what might happen after polling day.
It's a democracy in trouble. And it's a democracy that's quite unhealthy and quite sick. And you're right, whoever wins on polling day, it will not go particularly smoothly, no matter what the result is. Even in the best case scenario of a very clear victory for one candidate or the other, and the other one concedes, there will be some rockiness, there will be some tension. What we don't know yet, because so much of this scenario is unknown, so many of the different elements are yet to be filled in, is just how rocky it's going to be and just how ugly it gets.
And you're there, Tom. You've been covering this. You'll be there when we actually have the election, the results come through. I mean, how worried are you about all of this?
Well, I suppose the journalist in me is just really, really curious to see what happens. But maybe the human being is also just a little bit worried about the health of this country, where this country goes. You know, it was such a beacon of democracy for so many years. And it really does feel like it's absolutely on this brink now, this precipice, with an extraordinary array of spectrums of which road it could go down. And one of those roads would be really, really sad for the country and quite frankly, for the world.
Tom Newton Dunn, who is covering the US election for The Times. And you can read more from Tom on this topic in The Times on Monday. And there is acres and acres of coverage, of course, from the US election, from the brilliant Times and Sunday Times teams all across the country. You can access that at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. The producer today was Emily Webb, the executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Setto. I'm Luke Jones. Have a good weekend.